Hi guys, Dr. Chloe Costigan here, Foam Mobility Doc. Today we're going to talk about the concept of hip hinging, which is this motion. This is what's super important for working on single leg stability, posterior chain strength, even some core stability. It is a foundational movement pattern. So what we need to do is we're going to break that down a little bit so then that way you can conceptualize it in order to ensure that you're actually getting the most out of those exercises. So let's first talk about the main players. So we're going to be talking about a few different joints because some of the joints need to move, some of them don't need to move. So we'll talk about the bones first that are responsible for creating that joint. So we'll talk about the thigh bone. So the thigh bone is the femur. That is what's going to be staying stable because our feet are planted. Then we're going to talk about the pelvis. So the pelvis, if you place your hands kind of like right in that kind of bony area, this is what we're talking about, the pelvis. The pelvis and the sacrum, the tailbone, we're going to think of as kind of one unit for the sake of this exercise. So the pelvis is the thing that's moving on the femur. Then we're going to talk about the lumbar spine. So that's that lower back. In this case, the lower back, so now this is kind of right where you think of where your waist is. This is that lumbar spine. So the lumbar spine is staying stable on the pelvis as you're moving. So let's break down the rest of that movement so we can kind of highlight what's moving and what's not. Now let's talk about one other area that is not moving. That's the knees. So in terms of when I'm doing that hip hinge, notice that my knee is just slightly bent and then I come forward. Here's what I see most frequently. People will do kind of this like half squat kind of motion because they're just trying to get more range of motion. Your body sees that my torso is coming toward being parallel to the ground. So we just try to achieve that in whatever way. So it kind of ends up looking a lot like this sometimes, is that we're bending the knees. Now the whole point though is that for a hip hinge, we want to try to load the hamstrings. So if I'm bending my knees, I'm not creating that tension in my hamstrings. So you should feel this through your hamstrings. So my knees are just going to be just slightly bent, and then I'm going to push my hips back, and I should feel some tension into the hamstrings. But you notice though, I'm not bending my knees anymore as I'm doing this. I'm also not letting my knees collapse in or push too far out to the side. One other thing that ends up happening is that people will kind of do a combination of both of those. So it will look kind of like this. So they're fine as they're coming down, then they begin to kind of flex a little bit and kind of bend their knees. So we want to avoid that, and we want to focus on you're just moving your pelvis on top of your femur, but your lumbar spine isn't moving and your knee joint isn't moving either. So for a hip hinge, what we're focusing on is that the pelvis is moving on the femur. So my lumbar spine isn't moving at all, it's just my pelvis that's moving on the thigh bone. To highlight that, one thing you can do is you can place a dowel or any type of broom or something like that on your back. So from my head to my middle back to my sacrum, I'm going to place that dowel there. So this will highlight the fact that the lumbar spine and the pelvis are staying as one unit, and I'm just moving those over top of my femur. So you notice that the only thing that's moving is just my pelvis moving on my femur. So here's what I see most frequently happen, is people will do this. So you notice how the dowel now is lifting up off of my back. That means that now I'm moving from my pelvis, but I'm also moving from my lumbar spine. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to move right from that hip crease. Another way that can be helpful to think about it is like if you put your hands kind of like where your pockets would be, and then you try doing that same motion. So I'm here, so I'm pushing my thigh bone back, and then I'm coming forward, just like that. Okay, so now we got down there, now we need to come back up. So the whole point of doing some type of hip hinge is to improve that posterior chain strength, and then it's also a foundational movement for improving any type of asymmetrical stability or single leg strength. Now, what happens though is that we end up using other muscles to compensate when we come back up. We're trying to use our glutes and our hamstrings. So when I'm doing this hip hinging motion, what I'm trying to do when I'm coming up is I'm trying just to move from my hips. So just like I just moved from my from that hip joint to come down, I'm just doing that to come back up. So I'll highlight it with the dowel. So I'm here and then I'm coming back up. So you notice that it's just my hips that are opening and closing. What I see happen most frequently is it ends up looking something like this. So I'm here and then I kind of start arching my back to come up. So you see how now my chest is nearly totally upright, but my hips are still way behind me. That means that I'm arching my back. And then what's gonna end up happening is like your back's gonna get pretty sore pretty quickly. This hip hinge inherently strengthens the back because it forces you to use your core and then also some of those lumbar paraspinal muscles. But the main driver though are the big muscles, your glutes and your hamstrings. So when I'm here and I'm coming down and up, I'm making sure that I'm using my glutes and my hamstrings to support that. So as I'm going down, my hamstrings are lengthening. I'm doing what's called an eccentric contraction. And then when I come back up, you notice like if I put my hand right where my hamstring and my glute meet, this is what is coming forward, okay? So then I'm not arching my back, I'm not doing anything else to compensate. The other thing that happens is that if you're bending your knees too much, what's gonna happen is you're just gonna kind of straighten your legs. So say I'm here when I'm doing this, then what ends up happening a lot of times is people are just kind of straightening their knees to come up and kind of arching their back. That's why it's imperative to make sure that you just have that slight bend in the knee and that you're initiating that movement by moving from the glute and the hamstring. Now that we understand the foundations of hip hinging, let's make it a strengthening movement. So I'm gonna grab 2 dumbbells and I'm gonna do that same, I'm gonna do the same idea that we just went over. So I'm gonna push my hips back, I'm moving just from the femur, and then I'm gonna come back up. So you notice though how the weights are staying pretty close to me, so I'm not letting them hang out in front of me. I'm using my lats to pull them in, and I'm just keeping that close, just like this. Now, just as a little bit of a preview, we'll go over 2 other types of hip hinging variations. The first one, so hip hinging you might also see as being called a Romanian or Romanian deadlift, or an RDL. So there's also these asymmetrical RDLs. So that's 1 leg forward, 1 leg back, and then you're doing that same motion where you're just now hinging just from one hip. So that front hip is the one that's primarily hinging. There will be a separate video just to kind of digest that a little bit more. And then finally, the last thing would be a single leg RDL. So that would be, so just a hip hinge just from 1 leg and then coming back up. Again, that requires its own conversation, but as you can see, we can quickly go from an RDL to an asymmetrical RDL to a single leg RDL. But the thing though that doesn't change is that you're doing a hip hinge motion from just that hip joint and not the lumbar spine and not the knee. Thank you guys for taking the time to explore the hip hinge motion with me. Make sure you like and share this video, and please leave any comments if you have any questions. Be sure to check out the rest of the mobility.youtube for all tips and tricks, as well as some mobility recovery videos as well.